As you know my name, I was born in Germany, and I was in first grade when Hitler came to power. Things started to change, but as a young child, I was not quite aware of what was happening. Shortly after Hitler came to power, one fine morning, a brown shirt, a Nazi, came to enter his office. As a matter of fact, he came to stand in front of the building to prevent any of his clients to come in. My father was a lawyer and also a city councilman in the town where we came from. That's number 2. Okay. Anyway, one man stood outside in front of the house to not let people come in, and 2 went inside to beat him up. My father had a hunting dog that was trained to attack people in the woods while he was hunting, who were trying to hunt themselves in areas that they were not permitted to. And so the dog was trained to attack such people. He had to hold onto the dog with all his power, all his strength, in order that the dog would not attack the brown shirts, and they got scared and ran out. That was the first experience about Hitler's power in Germany and his attack on Jews as not being human beings. From that day forward, things went worse and worse for Jews in Germany. I didn't get anything to fear from it for the first few years because I was in a Jewish elementary school, and so we were a group that was left alone, children in school. But in Germany at the time, the elementary school lasted for 4 years, not 6 like here, and so high school was coming up. And high school, there was no Jewish high school in our town, which was called Hildesheim near Hanover in northern Germany. And my parents were looking for a place that I could go without being attacked or being put aside in the classrooms by the teachers and whatever. And so they went to the Ursuline school in town that was run by the nuns, and where they had heard that they were very friendly to children, to Jewish children. They had opened their school for Jewish children. And so I was among 8 of them who were admitted to the school, and the nuns were absolutely wonderful. Not only did they not require us to convert to Christianity, they were taking care of the fact that in other schools and all over town, Jews were being prevented to participate in whatever was going on, whether it was schools, whether it was entertainment, whether it was sports, you name it. More and more was permitted, was no longer permitted for Jews. Among the people who was hit by this was my sister. She was in high school in the top grade, and graduated in 1933, the same year that Hitler came to power. She was going to go to university to study law and then become a partner in her father's office, but with Hitler coming to power, no more Jews were permitted to go to university. So my parents sent her instead to Edinburgh, to the university, to learn English and to learn business. This was very good. She did that for a year and a half. Then she came home during vacation, and my parents sent her for another year to the Sorbonne in Paris to learn French and Spanish. Of course, in high school they had English and French, but no Spanish. But she wanted to be able to speak the languages, to use the languages in business. My sister, after a year in Paris, came back to Germany, worked in her father's office as a secretary for a few months, and then went to America, to the United States. So she was safe as of 1937. Meanwhile, things got bad and worse for my parents. Of course, he couldn't do any more work as a city councilman, and he couldn't have any clients other than Jews, and the Jewish congregation in Hildesheim was, at the beginning of Hitler's coming to power, some 500 members of the congregation. And of course, as things got worse, they fled to larger town if they couldn't flee or escape out of the country. By 1938, we were no longer permitted to use the streetcars or public transport. And one fine day, my father received a call on a Saturday from a friend at police headquarters to tell him, who told him that the Gestapo was going to come to pick him up on Monday morning, and he would go to concentration camp. My father was physically somewhat debilitated by kidney stones and kidney attacks, and so he said he could not survive going to a concentration camp. So my mother took him to their bedroom, and my grandmother was living with us by that time because they were farmers in the north of Germany. They had a farm that was in the family for some 200 years, and the Gestapo had come to them and had kicked them out of the farm and expropriated it and taken their accounts and everything else and kicked them out of the village where they were living. So they came to us, she and her eldest son, my mother's brother. Grandmother stayed with us. This was in 37. And my uncle went to Berlin to a Jewish group that was training young Jewish men and women to become farmers in Palestine. He was a farmer. He had a large farm in Berne before, and so he was very involved in agriculture. He also happened to be a lawyer, but that he gave up when his brother was killed in World War I and took over the care of the farm. Well, meanwhile, my parents didn't know what to do. They decided they had to get out of the country. By that time, all Jews had to give up their passports, and without a passport, you couldn't go abroad. So they decided to go to a cousin near the Dutch border in Germany and find out whether there was a passeur, somebody who would take them across the line, across the border, to the Netherlands. They got there on Saturday night, and on Sunday, my father talked with the passeur who came to visit, and who said he could not take him over himself, but gave him exact information and how to go about crossing the border. My mother still had a passport, so she went at the train and went to Amsterdam. My father went to the border and walked along on the highway. The highway was Germany on one side, the Netherlands on the other side. There was only that highway and a little ditch, and on the Dutch side was a farm with large patches of grazing land. He went to that along that highway, and every 10 minutes the German police came by on motorbikes to make sure that nobody was skipping across the border. And then 10 minutes later they came back again. He watched them several times passing one way and then the other. And then as they went around the bend, he jumped across the ditch and was in the Netherlands. It was a Sunday morning in May, and it was a beautiful day, and the farmer and his family were having their coffee out in the backyard, and saw him jumping, and clapped their hands and waved him over to come to see them. They told him that he could stay with them or he could go on, whatever he wanted. He asked whether they had a telephone, which they did, and he called his brother, who was a Dutch citizen in Amsterdam, and the brother sent a car, and 2 hours later he was picked up and went to Amsterdam and got reunited with my mother. I didn't know about any of this. I only knew that my father had been sick and that my mother had taken him to Berlin to the university clinic, and that he would have surgery and they would be gone for several weeks. Fine. I went to school, everything was fine. This went on for 2 months. And then one fine day, I picked up the mail from our mailbox in front of the house. And there was a letter with the handwriting of my mother, and the envelope had Dutch stamps, postage stamps. That's how I found out that my parents were not in Germany any longer. Well, then the question was, could I come to the Netherlands? My parents had requested that I would be permitted to go and join them. After all, I was a minor, and that her mother, who was living with us, would take me and bring me and then live with them. The Dutch did allow my coming to the country, but they did not permit grandmother to join. The Germans did give me a vacation passport for 2 weeks to go to the Netherlands. And so a cousin came, another Dutch cousin came with a car, picked me up, took me to the Netherlands, across the border, no questions, no problems, and we lived in Amsterdam. my parents had a sublease of a few rooms in a Dutch apartment, and so that's where I was with them. But I had to go to school, of course. This was, by that time, September, so the next semester was starting in high school. And I wanted to go to high school, but I didn't know Dutch. Well, they put me in elementary school, 2 classes behind, and that's where I started and learned Dutch and learned what they were learning in the Netherlands. And when I felt ready that I knew enough Dutch to do the lessons in Dutch, the principal of the school would not let me try and catch up with my age group. So I was in that elementary school in 5th grade for the full year. Then my parents found a private school that had a different program, and they allowed me to come there on a scholarship, and I was permitted to work as hard, as fast as I could, and I did 2 grades in 1 year. Then the Germans invaded the Netherlands, and we were right back where we started, because the school had to close, and I was back in public school and 2 grades back. But it was high school by that time. Well, the war came, and by 1940, the Germans invaded the Netherlands, and we were right back the way we had been in Germany. People that were Jewish were not human, according to the Germans. At least not quite human. And so the Jewish children had to leave the schools. They could only go to Jewish schools. The Jewish school in Amsterdam, where we lived in the south, was on the east side, more than an hour's walk to get there, because we were not permitted to use public transport any longer. We were not permitted to use regular stores except at certain hours, and only except at stores that were not of very good type of merchandise. And so things became very difficult. And I was able to join that group, and again, I was permitted to work as fast as I could do it, and was able to do 2 years in 9 months. And that was the end of schooling altogether. By that time, we were wearing the Jewish star, number 2. There we go. There's the Nazi in front of the business elsewhere, but that's how it was at our front door that day in April. And this we had to wear the Jewish star on our coats, on our garments, so everybody would know that we were people who were not worth doing anything with or for. Anyway, by that time, I could no longer be in school and had to have a special ID card that permitted me to work, but to work only in a Jewish institution. This is number 5, please. card with me. Okay? You see on top there is a stamp, and that says, owner of these papers is for the moment excused from being in the workforce. That meant a concentration camp. Okay? Question? Okay. Well, by that time, my father, who had escaped Germany in 1938, and my mother, who had escaped Germany in 1938, had been given prison sentences. Why? Because they had escaped without paying the escape tax for Jews. The escape tax was paid by my father. He had paid it into a special account to be given to the finance department of the city, and so it was there in full. But when they had left without going to give them the money in person, they had gotten the prison sentences, and the Gestapo had confiscated and not paid the finance department the escape tax. And that's why the Germans came after us to put my parents into prison in Holland, or from Holland. At the time, my mother was ill in hospital, and so they agreed that my parents could take their sentences in one after the other instead, simultaneously, because after all, I was home alone, and I was a minor, and we had people living in the apartment who were paying rent and had to be taken care of, and so they agreed that my parents could take their sentence one after the other. They took my father, took him back to Germany, put him in prison in Kleve, which is near the German-Dutch border, and there he was for 3 months, and that was in 1942. He was not mistreated in particular in prison, and after 3 months, the German police took him back to Amsterdam. Very unusual, but it was a police business, it was a judicial business, so they went judicially and brought my father back in order that he could be picked up and sent to a concentration camp. Well, by this time, we were worried that we would not survive anything with concentration camp. And so we had to try and find a place to hide. Very difficult at that time. Of course, people went into hiding. But you had to have somewhere where you went in hiding. That you had to find, people had to be found who were willing to put their lives and their families on the line in order to hide Jews or other criminals. It took some 3 months after my father came home that we found somebody who was willing to think about it. Meanwhile, there were a lot of raids going on at night. Raids meant that the Gestapo or other police came to houses and just picked up Jews put them in into like a collection point, and then when they had enough people collected, they were sent to a concentration camp in the Netherlands in order to be sent from there somewhere in Germany, in Poland, in Near Eastern Germany, whatever they could do, and of course nobody knew where that was. Because once they were out of the Netherlands, nobody knew where they were, there was no more correspondence or anything else. My father was picked up at night, and while he was putting a few things in a briefcase to take with him, I gave him copies of my work paper and told him, use this to try and talk your way out of the collection point and come back home. He was in the collection point for 2 days. When the second day came around, there were some 600 people collected in that concentration camp. Adults, children, old people, it didn't matter. And people who had a request to be released for some reason or another could go and ask for an interview with the police, with the German police, who was in charge of this particular building. But they weren't permitted themselves to talk with the police. Even though my father was perfect in German and not very good in Dutch, that didn't matter. Only a Dutch representative was able to speak for him. Well, he said he had a daughter who was a minor and who was employed. His wife was ill. He had to take care of people who were boarders in our apartment. And he said he couldn't do all that. He needed to go home. Well, going back and forth, what did the daughter do? Well, the daughter, in the Montessori system, I don't know whether you are aware of it, in the nursery school, each person that works for them is called a leader. It's not a teacher, it's not anything else, it's a leader, whether that is a paid person, whether it is a person who is trained as a nursing school teacher, didn't matter. Volunteers who worked with them were all leaders. When the Dutch guy who was interpreting for the people who requested to be released heard that the daughter was working, and he asked what she was doing. The Dutch man said that I was the director, not of a nursing school, but the director of the Montessori school, which was a high school. He said, well, how old is that daughter? She's 16. Donnerwetter! 16? That's extraordinary. Send the father home. Lucky break. He went home. He came home and he said, we have to go into hiding. We have to find a way to escape. Well, we didn't know where to go to ask for help. We went to our cousins who were Dutch, and they had some connections, and a few days later, a young man came to our door, wanted to talk with us, and said, well, we'll try and get you some hiding place. We don't have anything for the parents, but we have something for your daughter. Well, my parents weren't very happy to let me go, and so there was back and forth for a couple of days, and the young man said, I can't help you if you do not follow what little help we can give, then I can't do anything for you. And the first one to go is your daughter. She is the youngest, she is the one most in need of being taken care of. So this was the beginning of the week. By the end of the week, I was going to leave. I was going to meet somebody whom I had never met in the streets of Amsterdam. My parents were not supposed to know where or with whom I was going. This was a young lady who was introduced herself in the streets of Amsterdam to me as Mia. The young man who came to us is on the left lower picture, and the young lady on his right was the young lady I met in the streets of Amsterdam. She took me to her studio. She was an artist, and from there we went to the city of Amerfoort. Amerfoort is right in the middle of the Netherlands. It's a smaller town, but it's a good-sized town, and I was located with a family of a widow with 5 children. They were very nice to start with, but the lady was not very friendly because I was Jewish, and she felt she needed to have me converted to Christianity, and I was not willing to do that. She had 5 children, 2 adult daughters, one son who was in the top grade of high school, and 2 younger children who were also in high school in the lower grades. I became the maid of the household. I had to do all the cleaning and the kitchen duties, and that worked all right. I mean, I was living there, I was getting food, I was able to have meals with the family, but after a little while they didn't want me to be with them in the living room after the meals in the evening, so I had a room and I was in my room by myself. This was not easy. I didn't know where my parents were. I knew that the young man had found temporary hiding for them, separate from each other. And then after a while, he found a place for my father with a nurse. The nurse had some people in hiding in her home, and he came and was supposed to only come for a week or so, and mother was staying with cousins who were still in their home. Well, my father was very handy in home repairs and such, and he was building a cooking box for the sister, for the nurse. And she thought that was so wonderful and asked that he would stay. And he said he would stay if my mother could join him. And so that was arranged, and my mother joined him at the sister's house. And there were 3 or 4 other people in hiding with this nurse. She was not married, so she was in charge. And because my mother did not look Jewish, she was permitted to go and open the door for people who came with deliveries and such, as long as the nurse was at work elsewhere, which was much of the daytime. The nurse came home in the evening, and since mother was good at cooking, she cooked for the entire group there. And after a while, the nurse also sent her out to do shopping for the family, what she called her family. That worked fine until one day there was a raid in the neighborhood, and the raiders came to this house. Some of the people were able to go in hiding under the ground, under the house that my father had prepared for them. And so the nurse was okay as far as not being involved with Jews and other people who were being pursued. But she had a lot of food and other things of merchandise in her house, and so they were very, very involved with that, and it took a while before they would leave, and when they finally left, she was being pursued. The same thing happened with me. In Amerfoort, there were also raids. And one fine day, there was a raid in our neighborhood. The entire neighborhood was looked up, and the police came and went from house to house and went through all the cupboards and all the rooms and all the quote-unquote hiding places to see whether there were people hiding. And in our house, we had no hiding place. I was in the kitchen, and I was peeling potatoes. After all, I was the maid. The family was driven into their living room. They were 6 people. The police didn't know I was there. They also had 2 visitors from out of town. So they were in the living room, and they were being watched by one of the policemen. The others 2 went through the house. And whereas they went through the other houses in the neighborhood and stayed half an hour, they came to this house and were there for over 4 hours. They found so many things that were not legal in their perception. That was big bags of grain, dry milk, a lot of radio tubes, because the eldest son was in a technical class learning how to build radios. It was high school, and this was at home for his homework, to make things that were required for the lectures. Well, they stayed, and they raided, and they went through and took stuff and threw stuff, and I don't know what all. I was in the kitchen. I didn't know anything about it. And then finally, in the end, they came to the kitchen, and there I was, peeling potatoes. And 2 of the guys went immediately to empty the cupboards. And the third one started talking to me, of course in German, and I didn't understand a word. I looked at him kind of, wat zegt u meneer? And he talked again to me, and since I didn't respond properly, he got tired, sick and tired of it, and forgot about it, and went on with the searching until they were done. Well, they left, but they took a lot with them, and the lady of the house was very scared that they might come back and then start working on me and working on her more. And so she said, you have to go to Amsterdam. You have to leave right now and don't come back until the coast is clear, until it's safe again. So I went on the train and went to Amsterdam and went to my cousins. They were still in their home. And no, sorry, they didn't. I went to my former elementary school teacher, and she took me in. She was home and said I could be there for a while, and she would notify my people that I knew in Amsterdam so that they could reach my parents perhaps and let them know that I was in town. It worked very nicely. The young man who had taken me, the young woman who had taken me out of town came and we talked, and she said, well, I'll see to it that your parents know where you are and met your mother can come and see you. And that's what happened. I was in Amsterdam for 2 weeks, and my mother and I met in the streets, and every day we went shopping because she had to go shopping for her household, and we went around town and admire the canals of the city. And every so often we went and stopped at a certain bridge in town. I don't think you can see it on number 9. This is the house. Okay. You can't see the numbers, it's too far away. But the next one that you just had. You see the house in the middle? That is the fraternity house where my parents were. And that is on one of the canals. And so we stood very often on the bridge that crossed the canal there and just admired the area. After we had done that many times, I figured that probably my parents were in one of the houses near there so that my father could see me from behind closed curtains. He was not permitted to go outside. He was not permitted to even go near the window with curtains open. So, in all the time that I was in hiding in Amerfoort and came once in a while to Amsterdam and met with my mother in the streets, he couldn't see me other than from behind closed curtains. But at least that was possible, and I didn't know that he had seen me. Anyway, I was in Amsterdam, first with my teacher, and then with a young university student who had an apartment in a house in the south of Amsterdam. It doesn't matter. In our former neighborhood, up in the attic, And so I could sit up there every so often and just watch the people of my neighborhood going about their business, many of whom I know, but they didn't know, of course, that I was there. After 2 weeks, I got notified that the danger was over and I could come back to Amerfoort. Meanwhile, my mother found that I had been homesick, that I was not happy where I was, and told Mia, who had come and visited me several times to bring me mail, that I needed to be taken elsewhere to another place to go hide. And so they worked it out. And when I came back to the family in Amerfoort, Mia told them that I would be leaving in 2 weeks. I would not stay with them, that I would go back to Amsterdam, and the lady of the house was very upset. Why? Because I lived with them, I was a maid, and I paid them, that is, my parents paid them a monthly fee for my being there. But after all, she couldn't do anything much about it, and so we said goodbye, and the young lady took me to the railroad station to go to Amsterdam, and 2 of the kids went along to say goodbye at the railway station. And after they left, we turned around and went in the opposite direction back into town. She took me to a young couple, couple newlywed, who wanted to give me time to recoup myself and look out for another hiding place for me. I wasn't going to be there for any length of time, but as long as I needed it, they would be glad to help me. And so the lady of the house brought in an aunt and some acquaintances and a cousin of her husband, and that was a young couple, and they had a child of their own, a 1-year-old, and they also had another child, a Jewish child, and she was pregnant. So they were willing to take me in without anything other than that they would pay me a little pocket money for whatever I needed, and I could stay with them as long as I needed to. And that was the family Verhey, young Renate Verhey, number 6. And the family, young Renate, on the left, Bertje, the Jewish child, on her lap, the baby that was born while I was there, and on the right, their daughter Martientje. Who was Bertje? They lived at the edge of town of Amerfoort. The opposite side of the street was grassland, and behind that were the woods. On our side were apartment houses, that is, 4 houses, 2-story houses in each block, and then gardens in back and in front, and the next 4 house building, the entire street. The Verheys lived on the right end of one of these. The parents of Bertje lived on the left of the same house, 4-house building. And so when the two women were pregnant with their first child, the Verheys offered the Scheiers, that was the Jewish family, to take in the baby, their baby as well, and registered the two children as twins in order to save the child, their child. But they didn't want to do that, and so when things got very difficult, the Scheiers went out into the countryside and went into hiding with a farmer. That's where the baby was born. And the baby screamed day and night. That took 2 months, and the farmer finally said, "We can't do that. Someone will hear, someone will betray, and then the child and we all will be gone." So the parents, the Scheier parents, allowed the child to leave, to be put into hiding elsewhere. They didn't know that the child was with the family who had offered them the hiding place for the child in the first place. But that worked out very well, only they couldn't say that the children were twins, so they were cousins. It worked fine. By that time, the children were 1 year old when I came, and by the time Bob was born, the baby boy, they were 2 years old. Well, I was with them until the end of the war. They were absolutely wonderful. They not only took care of the babies and me and whatever, there were always people who needed a hiding place temporarily, and they took them in. One time, there was a rabbi and his family of 5. This was a small house. They had 4 bedrooms. And not only did they take care of keeping them in the house and keeping them safe, they were working under the kosher restrictions. They learned how to cook, the wife learned how to cook kosher and made sure that the meals were kosher for the rabbi and his family. That was very difficult because certain foods were not permitted to kosher households. You couldn't mix milk and meat, that is dairy and meat, and all kinds of other restrictions, certain fish, pork, you name it, they couldn't eat. And it was very hard to get food in the first place because this was the war, and it was in the middle of the war, and the rations were less and less day by day. But they managed. At another time, there was a young lady, and she came and lived with us for 5 months. And that was in 1944. In 1944, the Allies had come from the south. They had entered France, and they were going north and east, and they were coming up along the way through Belgium to the Netherlands, and got as far as the River Rhine. The River Rhine goes through the southern part of the Netherlands, and then the Allied turned into Germany from there. So the young lady was with us. We were north of the Rhine, and we didn't get liberated. So we thought, when the Germans were being scattered further north and further north, that we would be liberated very soon. Didn't happen. And this young lady was with us, and very shortly after they turned east, all our rations were just absolutely reduced to eventually, by November, December, to 800 calories per adult per day. Very little meat. For babies, 1 quart of milk per week. For adults, 3 slices of bread, but that was bread mixed with, peas or whatever, pea meal or such, per day at most. No butter, no milk for adults, no meat, except very once in a while. After a while, the potatoes were gone. No more potatoes. We were down to tulip bulbs and I don't know, you name it. And so everybody tried to get food in the countryside. That went pretty decently for a while, but then the farmers didn't have any more either, because the Germans had taken most of their stuff already. At the same time, there was no more electricity, no more gas, no more fuel of any kind, and people started to cut down trees. And that was dangerous for the Germans, because they were hiding their airplanes in the woods under the trees. They were hiding all kinds of cannons and stuff under the trees. So if anyone cut down trees, that was just as bad as everything else, like an enemy of the Reich. And so they were either taken to prison or to concentration camp or shot at the moment. Here we were, a family of 6 by then, and where to get fuel, and if you had fuel, how to burn it, because you couldn't use a whole tree in the big stove. Most people didn't have a stove like that. They had gas stoves or electric stoves. And there was no gas or electric. So people took large cans, from the store, cans of vegetables, cut the bottom into strips that they took out, some strips, and that was the bottom of their stove. And they put little pieces of wood in the top and put a match to it, as long as they could find matches. That worked for a while, but it got more difficult every day, and it got winter, and it got very cold, and it got snowy, and people got caught cutting down trees. What to do? We had 3 little kids that had to be fed, in addition to the adults. And there were raids all the time. So the pianist and I went to the woods, and we did cut little trees. And of course we got caught. The Germans talked to us. It was a sergeant with his little troop, and I didn't react because I didn't know any German. And Willie, that was the girl, the pianist, talked in German, pretty good German, and joked with him and didn't give in to be fearful or anything like that. And he got so fascinated that by the time we got through on that day, he helped us with a sled to take the cut wood home. That is to the edge of the wood. He didn't know where we lived. And he said, well, we'll see you when you come back. Okay. So we came back 2 or 3 times a week from November until the end of the war. And he made sure that his troop took care of us when he was sent to the front in March. And the troops said they would do it, and they did. We didn't have food much, but we had fuel whenever we needed to go to the woods to get some wood. And in the cities, in Amsterdam, they had the Jewish quarter that was empty by then, and so the houses were torn down, and the stairs and the the beams and everything else was used as fuel. So that's how it worked. We didn't hear from my parents very much. They didn't hear from me very much because you couldn't travel. There was no train, there was no bus, there was no transport of any kind. If you had a bicycle, you were lucky if the Germans didn't pick it from you. And it was very difficult. You had to survive. I used to go into the countryside to the farmers and traded clothing and house goods for the family and brought back some food. And so did the husband, and so did the mother, the young woman. And so we did pass through and did not starve to death, but we got close. And then came my birthday in February. And lo and behold, there was a visitor who, Mia, she had managed to come on her bicycle to Amerfoort. And she brought letters, and she brought some food from her parents. And, no, she didn't bring food. She brought letters and some wood. And we had a birthday party. And fortunately, we had music, even at night. Why? We had a bicycle hung up between 2 chairs in the living room where there was a piano. And there was, of course, a lamp from the bicycle that was now put over the piano. And so she could play, and the head of the household played violin and viola, and they played together. And the rest of the family sat for 20 minutes on the bike, pedaled in order to get electricity. And we had lights so they could read the music. And we had music. And that was very important because life was so hard and so difficult, and every day was a struggle to make it from end to end. Well, when the war ended, we were pretty much like this, except me. I was like this. That was water just in the system. The the whole system wasn't working right. And so instead of getting thinner and thinner, I got bigger and bigger and bigger. And my clothes didn't fit anymore. And, oh yes, my mother had gotten some clothes from people that came to visit at the fraternity, and one of the people who were in hiding there put clothes together and made larger outfits and sent them. And so I had some clothes that I could find room enough in to wear. Well, anyway, the end of the war came. On May 4th, 1945, we had a radio. We had it underground, and we were listening to it, and we heard, "Peace tomorrow." And that was the end of the war. The next day, we were liberated. It was unbelievable. But before the end of the war came, the British and the Americans had already flown food packages all over the country and dropped it. So that from, I guess, April onward, we got bread, some butter, some this, that, and the other, because of all the food that was dropped. Not only over Amerfoort, but over Amsterdam, over the occupied areas. And that helped to save some people. There were many who just dropped dead in the months before that. There were many that still dropped dead because they were so far gone. Well, now the war was over. That didn't help very much. We had no telephones, we had no electricity, we had no gas, we had no fuel. But communication started. And after 3 days, there was a man on a bicycle that came to the garden, dropped the bicycle off at the gate, and came inside. I was with the children in the front yard. We were playing, and he said hello and would like to speak to Mr. and Mrs. Verhey. And I said, they are inside, go ahead. But before he got in, he walked in. He hunkered down before the kids and said hello, and said hello particularly to Bertie. Then he went inside, and after a while he came out again, and he said, I'm Bertie's father. And Bertie wouldn't want to let him go. She just took to him. He was there, he was hunkering before her, before them. She took his hand and wouldn't let go. Somehow grinned all over her face. And then he said, look, I'm coming back in 3 days' time with your mom, and we take you home. Then she let go. And he left, and he came back after 3 days and took Bertie with him. And, well, I hadn't heard, of course, from Amsterdam. They hadn't heard from me. They didn't know whether I was alive or dead. And after 12 days, the Verhey family was on their own. There were no other people hiding with them anymore. They had found their wherever they were going. And so I left as well and held my thumb up on the street, and there was a Canadian truck who stopped, And I asked them, are you going to Amsterdam? Yes, we are going to Amsterdam. Where in Amsterdam? The center of Amsterdam. Wonderful, may I join you? May I come in? Yes, come in. And so they dropped me off in the middle of Amsterdam, and near the bridge where I knew I had been observed, and crossed the bridge and figured I'd go from house to house to see whether my parents were somewhere in one of the houses. I was sure they were in one of those houses. And they were in the first house where I rang the bell. And so we were together again. And that was the end of the war. And then it took another 3 months before we found a place where we could rent an apartment or rent a few rooms. And then my parents went to find a school for me because I didn't have a diploma. I didn't have a high school diploma. And I was 19, and I would need it in order to get an education. And they talked with friends, and the friends had a daughter who had gone to a secretariat of Oxford University at the east side of the Netherlands. The school had been closed, but had reopened meanwhile, since the liberation. And so they were giving classes again, but they didn't really have a full school group, students or teachers yet. So they accepted me temporarily that I should do my entire high school education. This was going to be from September until Christmas. That was several years of high school. They would accept me to try that. So I went. And I managed. Because after all, we were going to the United States. My sister was in America, in Manhattan. And as soon as we got contact with people who came to visit us, people that came back with the armies, we were able to contact my sister, and she started sending clothing and food and all kinds of things, and a bicycle. And we were going to America. After all, my parents were first choice for people to be immigrants, because their daughter was American citizen. And I was still a minor, so I could come with them. It took a little over a year for the paperwork to be ready. And so I was in a hurry to get to America before I was 21, and left the Netherlands in August of 46 with a children's transport. Went through France to Marseille. We had a boat. There was a boat that had been a German trader before World War I, had been given to France after World War I as payment for the war, and had been had left for the United States just before the Germans came to Marseille. It was in the Mediterranean, and so it became a troop transport for the United States. was rebuilt for that, with loadings becoming triple deckers for the army to be shipped back and forth, whatever it was. And they hadn't been refinished or refurbished. They were still mostly transport, with a couple of first and second class cabins that were sold twice by the captain, and the ones that didn't find a bed in the first or second class, they ended up with refugees that were being transported to the United States. And the boat took us. It was in August, and it was pretty nice weather going across the Atlantic slow. We stopped several times because the engines ran out of whatever it was and broke down. It was an old ship. And finally we came into New York Harbor, that is into the bay, not into the harbor. And we couldn't go into the harbor because the harbor personnel was on strike. And here we were, with all our good intentions, out of food, out of fuel, out of everything, sitting on a Saturday in the bay, and couldn't go to the harbor. Well, on Sunday morning, the police came and picked the children's transport up. And that, they brought us to the harbor, to the quay, and there was my sister with her husband waiting for me. And that was it. 6 weeks later, my parents came direct from Rotterdam on a regular ship, and we all moved in with my sister. She had a one-bedroom apartment. And she took me immediately to Hunter College. You know what Hunter College is? It was the city college of New York City. And anyone who could pass the entrance exam could become a student there. Wonderful place. $16 per semester for as many credits as you could handle. And the books and everything else included. Well, my sister had gotten me a green card. We had gone the first day to the police to get the green card for me. And so I was taken in, but not as a regular student, because I didn't have an American high school diploma. So they told me I would have to take the exam the next semester, the spring semester, and then we could see whether I could manage it. And meanwhile, I could take some courses in English and in American history, and that would be all. It worked. And from there, things worked. I mean, I worked on the side, I had jobs, and I had a full-time study program for 5 years. And then I got my diploma, and that was it. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Neeman. We do have some questions And then if you do want to ask a question, come on up and you can use the microphone as well. What do you think was the most difficult aspect during your time of hiding?
Being unable to have free communication with my parents, with people that I was interested in finding, in communicating with, and being worried about people who took care of them at the risk of their lives, of their families' lives, on my behalf.
Okay. What methods did you use for hiding your fear, both physically and also internally?
Living from day to day, trying to do my best to not make it harder on the people I lived with, trying to help them as much as I physically and otherwise was capable of. But that wasn't very much.
Do you ever feel bitter or resentful, or how are you able to forgive those?
That has nothing to do with the people that took care of me. It has only to do with the idiocies of the difference between thinking that I am the only one who is worthy and my people are the only ones who are worthy, where everybody else who is not of my particular, whether it is religion or belief or background or whatever, is not worth it. That is what I had been taught by the Germans. And that was one of the things that I resented absolutely. I mean, I was in Germany in high school, and the nuns put their school on the line for me at the end. We started with 8 Jewish children. They had opened the school just the year before I was ready to come to their school. And the nuns opened the doors, and we were 8 people in various classes. And as things got worse and worse, the nuns were more protective with everything. Protective in the sense that they took me as a normal student, didn't allow the other students to harass me, didn't allow a few teachers who were not very nice to go after me. And the last year and a half, I was the only Jewish student in the school. Then the Gestapo called in the Mother Superior, who was also the head of the school, and told her she had to kick me out or else the school would be closed. And Mother Teresa, as she was called, refused. She did not kick me out. She did not tell me that I was supposed to be leaving. I was there for another year, not knowing anything about it, until I left to get to my parents. And I heard about this only after the war. They did close the school, but they closed it after I left. And that was unbelievable. They were absolutely unbelievable. They never tried to convince me to become Christian. They never requested that I should go to their religious classes. I was free to follow my own uses of the school. And they were always there to be friends. I visited them after the war. And I'm in
that's amazing. Someone asked a question about the term alias next to people's names on your PowerPoint, and was the alias the name you went by in hiding, or was it a name given by the Germans?
No, that was a name that I used in hiding.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So that was the name you chose to go by in hiding?
No, that were the papers that I had. I had false papers. And at the first place, I was Zwaantje Diekema. Zwaantje means little swan. In the second house, was for Hayes, I was Luca, which is my middle name. Luca Antonia Cornelia Rossos. That's the papers I had. I don't have them anymore.
How did you find someone to hide you without word getting around that you were trying to get into hiding?
Well, it happened through my family. It turned out that these young people, the young man who was called Pete, that was his alias, and Mia, that was her alias, were friends of my cousin Gideon, best friends. They lived in the same street, the two families, across from each other. And so Pete and Mia had gone into work for the underground. And so then my cousin knew, and he was the one, they were the ones who put them into the fraternity house. Pete was Ivo Schuffer. Ivo became a professor of history, and he was a professor at WWII University, and I have last seen him in 2010 when I was in the Netherlands. Mia, or Lydia, died before I came. And their two cousins, Marijke, alias Mariska, and Jan, his name was Jacobus, were their cousins. And the four young people and their aunt were in charge of the fraternity house care from the outside. And so I've been in touch with them until Ivo died. And he was the last one of the group. And their parents were very good friends. And so they also helped the household a great deal. They had people in their house too. I didn't.
And feel free to not answer any of these, because some of these I know are more personal, but somebody asked about people that you lost during the war. Or did you lose a lot of friends and family?
I lost a lot of family. My father had 10 brothers and sisters, of whom 2 died before the war, and 6 of them perished. Fortunately, of my generation, only 1 perished in that family. My grandmother on my mother's side perished. Lots and lots of cousins, lots of friends. In the Netherlands, it was very bad. The Germans came there. Before the war, there was a Jewish population all over the country of 140,000 people, 140,000 Jews. When the Germans started the war, some 25,000 managed to get out of the country. Some went overseas, some went to France, some went to other countries, either in Europe or elsewhere. And we don't know what happened to them, except if they were related or friends. Of the ones that remained, some 20 to 25,000 went into hiding, but not everybody made it through hiding. Many were caught. So that the Germans sent 105,000 Jews into concentration camps, extermination camps. How many do you think returned? 5,000. That's all. So many people got caught and perished. For why? Because they were Jews.
What was your first reaction when you were told you had to wear the star?
I hated it, but I wore it. You had to. If you didn't, you were sent right away or shot.
All right. Thank you for coming today and sharing your story with us, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with her. So one more round of applause for them.